Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
The year is 2007. Clint Hawking just put out a blog post critiquing BioShock for exhibiting a new term that he invented called ludonarrative dissonance. His definition of this term is flawed, and therefore so is his subsequent critique of BioShock. But who really cares? It's some random dude's blog post. Surely it won't have earth-shattering effects in the larger game analysis sector. I'm not here to tell you all that ludonarrative dissonance doesn't exist. I don't think it's the disturbing, internal consistency-shattering thing that some people say it is, and this video could have just as easily been about how ludonarrative harmony makes a game better more so than ludonarrative dissonance makes a game worse. That'll come up, but for now, my goal is to tear this blog post apart and argue that BioShock is not ludonarratively dissonant, and that Hawking's personal opinions and expectations of the game leaked into his essay enough to weaken the definition of the term he coins. So would you kindly sit down, grab some popcorn, and enjoy. Clint Hawking is a Canadian game designer and game director. He's worked on games like Splinter Cell and that one good Far Cry game that people all love. No, not that one. There we go. So he has some pretty solid qualifications. He says his favorite game of all time is System Shock 2, which explains why he would have such a vested interest in BioShock, as it was made to be somewhat of a spiritual successor to the System Shock series. Hawking opens his blog post by addressing the difference between game reviews and game critiques. Game criticism is for game developers and professionals who want to think about the nature of games and what they mean, he says. Game reviews are for the public, for people who play games, and they are intended to help those people make decisions about which games they should buy. And he's right. It's important to analyze games beyond which ones are fun and which ones aren't. A good example that could highlight the importance of this difference is a game like Resident Evil 6. I love that game to death, and it's super fun to play in co-op mode, and I would definitely recommend it. But this game is a mess when it comes to things like the HUD, the controls, and the plot. You can kind of think of it as qualitative versus quantitative analysis. A review ultimately ends with a verdict of good or bad, and they tend to be wildly subjective, while a critique takes a deeper dive into the game to figure out exactly why and how this can be applied to future games. It's a little confusing, I know, but would you kindly forgive me though? After all, I'm just a semi-literate, half-blind Neanderthal trying to comprehend the sandblasted hieroglyphic poetry of a... What the f... Hawking makes it very clear that what we're about to read is a critique and not a review, assuring us that he quite enjoyed playing through BioShock and that if this was a review, it would be glowing. However, his choice of language throughout the essay shows us that this might not be the whole truth. He goes on to say that BioShock invites us to ask important and compelling questions, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, in most cases, he thinks the answers BioShock provides to those questions are confused, frustrating, deceptive, and unsatisfactory. To Hawking, BioShock suffers from a powerful dissonance between what it is about as a game and what it is about as a story. He argues that by making the narrative and ludic elements of the game oppose each other so much, the game openly mocks the player for having believed in the game's fiction in the first place. This supposedly destroys the player's ability to feel a connection to either the story or the gameplay, and that the only two options, the only two possible solutions to this issue, are to either stop playing the game, which he actually admits he almost did, or go, whatever, I guess I can't enjoy this game, but I paid for it, so I might as well finish it. And this is really reductive and also extremely subjective. I don't know about you, but I've never abandoned something in protest that I would write a glowing review of, but maybe that's just me. Regardless, we can see the beginning of Hawking's habit of equating his personal opinions with objective facts about game design and enjoyment. That's a great question, Clint. I'm glad you asked. I was wondering, though, why are we using such strong and emotive language in what's supposed to be an analytical critique? Oh, my bad, I guess. BioShock does not hesitate to tell the player what it's about. Ultimately, it's about how selfishness and power will eventually corrupt, which is very noticeably a big middle finger to laissez-faire capitalist ideology and the one and only Ayn Rand. Rand is most famous for coming up with the philosophy of objectivism. Objectivism revolves around the self and the idea that altruism is inherently immoral. She believed that if everyone does what's best for them, in complete disregard for others, they will inherently do things that are beneficial to all of us. No gods or kings, only man. Hawking says that BioShock is both an examination and critique of Randian objectivist philosophy. But it's an examination in the same way that you examine that Tupperware that's been in your fridge for a few too many weeks. Nobody wants to open and clean it, everyone knows it sucks, and you're gonna have to throw the whole thing out anyway, but someone's gotta do it. Ultimately, it serves as a critique. Rapture as a whole was built upon this foundational belief of rational self-interest, and we can see pretty well how that turned out. So, BioShock thinks Rand sucks. And let's take a look at how Clint Hawking interprets this message. The game begins by offering the player two contracts, he says. One is a ludic contract, literally seek power and you will progress. This is not a unique ludic contract, as a lot of games have this philosophy. It can be seen in games like God of War, Metroid, or God of War, for example. The only issue is that seek power to progress isn't really the ludic contract of BioShock. Ludic contract is kind of a fancy way to say the agreement you make with the game when you play it. The ludic contract of a game like Call of Duty is don't think too hard and shoot the current enemy of the US government, for example. So seeking power is an element of BioShock's ludic contract because of the few plasmids that you need, but the more encompassing ludic contract would be in line with a game like Resident Evil 4 or Portal. And that ludic contract would be survival by any means necessary. Leon executes a Spaniard in RE4 to survive, so if you need to kill a couple little girls to get by, you gotta do what you gotta do. The main difference between these two contracts is that in a game like BioShock, Portal, or Resident Evil, you don't need to gain much more power to progress. It makes it easier, yeah, but it's not directly tied to the progression of the game. In BioShock, you don't need every plasmid or every gun to progress. In something like Metroid, however, you are genuinely unable to progress the game if you don't have the right equipment. There are barriers all over the place meant to halt your progress if you lack the proper piece of equipment. In God of War, you're trying to kill gods to gain their power because you need it in order to kill Zeus, and in God of War, you need to get a new, more powerful weapon in order to kill a god to save your son. Hawking then takes a little leap, saying that this ludic contract is in line with the values underlying Randian self-interest. The rules of the game say it is best if I do what is best for me without consideration for others. Here, Hawking equates the so-called rules of the game to seeking power and progression. The issue is that his idea of the rules of the game is kind of wrong. I don't want to say it, but there's no real good way to dance around it. It's just not really correct. And this is something we'll see again, but Hawking has a very distinct lack of evidence for many of his claims. It only makes sense, though, that starting with a faulty foundation will result in a faulty conclusion, the foundation here being his aforementioned ludic contract. He then decides that the ludic contract he presented is in line with Rand's beliefs before coming to the final conclusion that the rules of the game tell him to be an objectivist. We look to the more accurate ludic contract of survival, and realize that the game is not trying to push Rand's beliefs onto us, but in fact much the opposite. After arriving in Rapture, we find a radio and meet Atlas, our guide who promises to get us out if we help save his family. So BioShock shows us from the very beginning that helping another person is the appropriate course of action. In fact, BioShock shows us that the only thing you really can do is help Atlas, but more on that later. Hawking continues. It must be pointed out that BioShock goes the extra mile and ties this game mechanical contract back to the narrative in spectacular fashion through the use of the Little Sisters. The Little Sisters are atom harvesters protected by the Big Daddies. They go around Rapture and harvest the residents for what little atom they have left. Adam is the stuff that made the plasmids, rewrites your DNA, gives you the lightning powers, and ultimately led to the fall of Rapture. You need Adam to upgrade your plasmids, which means when you finally meet one of these little sisters, you're presented with a choice. Atlas is telling you to kill the girl to get a bunch of Adam and get more powerful. Tenenbaum, the Holocaust survivor turned Nazi scientist that originally created the Little Sisters, expresses regret and gives you the ability to return them to normal. In return, she promises to take care of the girls and compensate you. However, saving them gives you significantly less Adam. Hawking goes on to say that by giving the player this decision, BioShock really allows the player to experience what it's like to be an objectivist. You can do what's best for you and get more Adam without consideration for the little sisters that you're killing. He says that, to be successful, the game would need to not only make me somehow adopt this difficult philosophy, but then put me in a pressure cooker where the systems and content slowly transform the game landscape until I find myself caught in the aforementioned trap. The point being made here is that in order to properly critique Randian objectivism, the game would have to make the player do the objectivist action of murdering the kids, and then show them at the end that littering the floor with the corpses of little girls is not actually a good thing to do. The trap that is believing in Rand led to the fall of Rapture in the first place, and he wants to see the game adapt to his choices and force him to see the consequences of adopting this philosophy as if it wasn't being shown to him already. Hawking believes that the game does not do this, and becoming an objectivist has no lasting impact on the story. But there is a trap, and it's called the bad ending. BioShock has multiple endings, based entirely upon how many little sisters you saved or killed. Kill enough, and you get the bad ending, where you take over Rapture and bring all of the crazy, plasmid-ridden residents to the surface, kill everyone, and take over the world. Save all the little sisters, and you get the best ending, where you bring the rescued little girls to the surface and raise them as your own to finally give them a chance at a normal life. So BioShock does put you in a trap, and it's no coincidence that being an objectivist gets you the bad ending. I feel the need to come clean about something. Harvesting or rescuing the little sisters is the only choice your character has in BioShock. It's the only time that your character gets to decide what to do because of his own free will. See, your character was born in Rapture and has been brainwashed to do whatever he's told, so long as the phrase, "would you kindly," is attached to it. This is the diegetic reason you do all the missions, and this is also the big twist at the end that Hawking finds insulting, disturbing, and mocking. If you ask me, it's pretty clever, but we're not here to discuss matters of opinion now, are we? In making this the only decision your character has in the game world, the game further disincentivizes being an objectivist, as taking the objectivist route gives you the worst possible ending. It basically says, congrats, we gave you free will and you went and fucked everything up. Thanks. So Hawking has laid out a ludic contract, and we went and laid out a more accurate one. But what about the narrative in Ludonarrative? What's the narrative contract? Hawking goes on to say that the narrative contract is help Atlas and you will progress. He calls out 3 problems he has with this contract. First is that it isn't in line with the underlying values of Randian self-interest. He says that helping someone else is presented as the right thing to do by the story, yet the opposite proposition appears to be true under the mechanics. Here, Hawking fails to make an important distinction. He says that the game's mechanics tell you to be an objectivist. However, the game mechanics give you the option to do something objectivist. Ignoring the fact that we dismantled the whole idea that the game tells you to be an objectivist earlier, this point is also misleading. Helping someone else isn't presented as the right thing to do, it's presented as the only thing to do. This is partially because Atlas knows about the whole brainwashing thing and is would you kindlying you around like a stray dog, but also completely ignoring that. I know if I arrived in a spooky underwater hellscape and someone offered to help, I'm taking that help. I could do the objectivist thing and go, screw you, Atlas, I don't need anybody's help but my own, and wait around to get drilled in the ass by a big daddy or killed by one of those diving suit guys, but I like my insides where they are, thank you very much. Hawking's second issue with the narrative is that Atlas is openly opposed to Ryan, yet again as mentioned above, he's philosophically aligned with Ryan by his acceptance of the mechanics. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here and re-explain how accepting the mechanics doesn't automatically align you with Ryan in a philosophical sense. So instead, I'm going to point out how there is a very blatant misunderstanding of the main conflict in BioShock. Atlas is openly opposed to Ryan, yes, but that's mainly because Ryan had him sentenced to death and took over his business once Atlas started stepping on his toes. In fact, Ryan saw Atlas's rise to power as proof that Rapture's philosophy was working. A man who came from nothing had made something of himself. So on a personal level, they're at odds. But on a fundamental level, they both want to control Rapture, and they both want a society where they can enjoy their destructive, objectivist philosophy. When you kill Ryan later on, Atlas assumes control of Rapture and plans to change nothing on a fundamental level. He just wants to bring his power to the surface and enjoy it up there too. Why do I want to stop Ryan, or kill him, or listen to Atlas at all, Hawking says. Ryan's philosophy is in fact the guiding principle of the mechanics that I'm experiencing through play. I'll once again note Hawking's lack of evidence. He says that Ryan's philosophy is the guiding principle of the mechanics, plural. However, the only mechanic that allows you to be an objectivist is the one involving the Little Sisters. Multiple times he mentions how the mechanics of the game endorse objectivist ideology, despite there being only one such game mechanic. Hawking says his third issue is how he doesn't have any choice in the conflict between Atlas and Ryan. Even though he's deciding to take an objectivist route through the game, he's still not allowed to side with Ryan. But, of course he isn't. BioShock isn't an RPG. In a game like Skyrim or Fallout, your character has no background or future. All that matters to your character is what happens between turning the game on and turning it back off. For the most part, there's no ending to these kinds of games, as completing the story quests doesn't end your character's journey given all the side content. In BioShock or Metroid or God of War or Resident Evil or Spec Ops: The Line, you play as a character with a past, present, and future that exist outside of you as a player. You don't get to decide how Kratos reacts to Atreus running away because you aren't Kratos. In the same vein, you don't get to decide how Jack, the protagonist of BioShock, reacts to Ryan or Atlas, because Jack has pre-existing relationships with these characters, unbeknownst to the player until the very end. Wanting Jack to be an in-game avatar of you as the player and subsequently share your ideals is like playing Spec Ops: The Line and going, damn, I wish my guy didn't feel so bad about killing civilians, I'm trying to do an imperialist playthrough. I think this comes from the fact that System Shock 2 is an immersive sim with very open-ended gameplay, and I think Hawking was expecting a similar situation in its spiritual successor. When he played through it and realized that BioShock is a very structured experience that didn't meet his expectations, it became a little upsetting. He calls this whole ordeal a serious problem, which he names ludonarrative dissonance. The gameplay mechanic lets you be an objectivist, but the story doesn't. Now, this is running on the idea that BioShock is trying to get you to be an objectivist, but as we've seen, BioShock is actually constantly telling us not to be. And this is what makes BioShock ludonarratively harmonic, as playing the game the way BioShock encourages does line up with the story, and how Jack gets unbrainwashed and defeats both Ryan and Atlas to save the Little Sisters. The dissonance that Clint is feeling is intentional, as killing the Little Sisters is supposed to feel like the wrong thing to do. It's not the fabric or nature of the game at its most fundamental level that one can perceive. It's someone who expected a lot more than they got and took it out on the Little Sisters scattered throughout Rapture. Now, I understand that the above criticism is harsh, but also that it is built upon complex arguments. So let me clarify a few things. This is my critique of Clint Hawking's blog post. If it was a review, I'd be praising his argument structure, how one step clearly leads to the next, and that the steps being made are logical, just that his first one was a little off. It's kind of sad, because I feel like he would have really enjoyed the game if he understood it a little better. But what do I know? I'm just a semi-literate, half-blind Neanderthal trying to comprehend the sandblasted hieroglyphic poetry of a one-armed Egyptian mason. Whatever the hell that means.